Good evening. In the words of an eyewitness on Tiananmen Square, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of dead in Beijing tonight. Democracy campaigners killed by the army as the troops stormed into the streets surrounding the square.
We don't want the army, we don't want gunshots and the army firing at the innocent people.
From the roof of the Great Hall of the People, the seat of communist power marooned in an ocean of protest.
With each day, the sheer size of the protest had mushroomed at what must have been an alarming rate for the government. These demonstrations have begun generating a bandwagon effect.
Young and old, academics, ministry staff, factory workers, miners, even soldiers.
Canton, more than 1,000 miles from the focus of the demonstrations in Beijing, thousands are on the streets.
The centre of Shanghai drew to a complete halt today as once again thousands of marchers converged to join protest over the Chinese leadership.
All the students in our college in Guangzhou, in China, support the students' action.
We support the students, these workers told us.
They want to fight for a bright future in China.
One college principal, sobbing with emotion, pleaded with his students not to join the march. There'll be bloodshed, he warned.
I think Chinese Communist Party should be wise and should listen to the people.
Crowds like this have never been seen before. Tens of thousands left their work today, streaming towards Tiananmen Square in support of the hunger strikers.
The Chinese government says it's prepared to meet protesting students after more than 100,000 demonstrated for democracy in Beijing today.
After less than an hour, the talks broke down. The students wanted the country's leaders to address them outside in Tiananmen Square.
They should come here. They should come here.
The Soviet news agency TASS said the Chinese authority had virtually lost control in the capital.
The voice of authority echoed over the darkened streets. Go home and you won't be punished. They had no intention of leaving, despite the government's warnings that measures would be taken to stop the chaos.
You're not scared of the soldiers?
I'm not scared. I will stay here. Somebody got to make some sacrifice.
If troops intervene, we won't try to defend ourselves. We won't use violence.
Do you believe a peaceful solution is possible now?
I think so.
The atmosphere is very tense. Students are singing songs. There's an air of a pending tragedy, I'm afraid.
The people are telling me now that if a single drop of blood is spilt, the whole country is likely to rise up against the government.
As we've been on the air, there have been fresh reports of gunfire and explosions in Beijing.
20 or more demonstrators were shot dead, others crushed by the military vehicles, ploughing through makeshift barricades.
Convoys of troop carriers charged through the streets, soldiers shooting at random.
The government of the people has become totally discredited in the eyes of the people. The massacre ordered by those in power has pushed China to the verge of anarchy.
Throughout the night, they marched on central Beijing. Students from every university in the city. Their calls for greater political freedom growing bolder by the hour. By the early hours, at least 100,000 people had swarmed into the vast Tiananmen Square, the biggest pro-democracy protest seen in China in over a decade. The police continued to show uncharacteristic restraint, though the authorities have issued orders to clear the square before the official memorial ceremony for former Communist Party chief Hu Yaobang. It's due to start in just 4 hours' time. Beneath the full moon, the students gathered round the monument to the heroes of the people, paying their respects to Mr. Hu. It was now clear they planned to stage a vigil in defiance of the government. They want their message of criticism to be heard by Deng Xiaoping and China's other leaders when they arrive at the Great Hall of the People to honor Hu Yaobang. But as the students settled down for the night, truckloads of armed police were moving into position behind the square. As the threat of massive confrontation drew closer, these inexperienced young policemen were clearly getting jumpy.
This is building towards the showdown China's leaders have long feared. In the next few hours, they must decide whether to smash this democracy movement by force or allow it to gather momentum. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Tiananmen Square, Beijing. At daybreak, the students were still defiant as they waited for the funeral of Hu Yaobang. They'd occupied Tiananmen Square all night against government orders. Now, in the face of such a direct challenge, the authorities backed down, allowing the students to stay to avoid confrontation. Outside the Great Hall of the People, the demonstrators jeered as Communist Party leaders arrived for the memorial service. Thousands of police sealed off the center of Beijing during the ceremony, forcing the city to a standstill. Thus, the funeral motorcade made its way to the cemetery for revolutionaries. An estimated 1 million people massed on the streets to honor the man who symbolized their hopes for political reform. It's been remarkable that such defiant demonstrations have been tolerated at all this week. But today, come the funeral, the Chinese authorities seem determined to show they are back in control of the streets. With the students daring to openly confront government, this week could prove a turning point in Chinese political protest. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing. They were attending rallies instead of classes today. They called on colleges throughout China to unite in protest. The boycott left classrooms empty at most of Beijing's 20 major universities. The government is reported to have cut off communications between campuses to stop the unrest spreading across the country. At Beijing University, wall posters denounced official corruption and called for the resignation of government leaders. This evening, the students were on the march again as China's communist leaders agonized over how to handle this growing challenge to their authority. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing. Undeterred by government threats, the students took their campaign onto the streets again. At roadside meetings across Beijing, they called on the people to back them. Workers gave donations to show sympathy with the pro-democracy movement. We support the students, these workers told us. They said they were fed up with official corruption. They felt exploited and oppressed. Yet the students have been officially accused of conspiring to poison the minds of the people and throw China into chaos. Today's People's Daily, the mouthpiece of the Communist Party, sternly warned that student protests were illegal. China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, is reported to have urged the authorities not to give in to student demands and severely punish anyone who violates the law. More troops have been ordered into Beijing in readiness for a crackdown. But fresh posters wallpapered the city with the students' defiant response. The government's toughest threat so far seems to have produced more fervor than fear. The students are angry at the allegations, determined to fight on.
They want to fight for a bright future in China.
I'm proud that I'm one of the members who fight for China's democracy and legal system.
The government now admits it's engaged in a serious political struggle with what it describes as unlawful elements. It says the fate of the nation could depend upon the outcome. Tomorrow, the students will put China's government to the test. They plan another massive march. Confrontation seems inevitable. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
China's students march on and the police let them.
The Chinese government says it's prepared to meet protesting students after more than 100,000 demonstrated for democracy in Beijing today. It was the largest anti-government protest for 13 years. The government wants the talks conducted through official student organizations, but the students have already rejected that.
The students marched out of the gates of their universities and into conflict with authority. They'd been warned all demonstrations were illegal. Hundreds of police cordoned their campuses with orders to prevent unrest. One student reminded them China's constitution allowed freedom of speech and protest. The demonstrators, claiming they were doing nothing unlawful, marched straight through police lines and onto the streets. At other universities, loudspeaker messages exhorted students to stay on campus and prevent social turmoil. Authorities at this college went even further, locking students in. Staff members formed a line to stop them leaving. Outside the gates, fellow students called for their release. One college principal, sobbing with emotion, pleaded with his students not to join the march. There'll be bloodshed, he warned. Ignoring his advice, they linked hands and set off to join the pro-democracy rally. Lines of police blocked roads into central Beijing. It was enough to deter some protest groups determined to avoid confrontation. On other routes, great waves of demonstrators surged on towards the city centre, sweeping aside the police. There seemed no animosity, no sign of violence from either side. All along the way, the public cheered and waved in support. The workers won't let the students be victimized, they shouted. As they passed a hospital, doctors and nurses ran out to will them on their way. A group of hospital workers joined in, despite government threats of reprisals against those who get involved in demonstrations.
The strength of the student movement, unabated after a week and a half, is bound to alarm the authorities even more. Yesterday, the Communist Party of China issued its harshest warning in years. Today, it's been totally ignored.
As the marchers reached central Beijing, crowds of ordinary citizens swelled the student ranks, filling the streets in a massive show of solidarity. Police moved in to seal off Tiananmen Square. Facing them, a demonstration stretching as far as the eye could see. The police put up some resistance, but the authorities had clearly underestimated the students' fervour, the people's support. Sheer force of numbers broke the lines as the protesters swarmed onto the square. Police backed off. This was the biggest demonstration of discontent in the history of communist China. So far, the government has failed to listen. Today, the voice of protest was too strong for their troops to suppress. The students had made their point. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Beijing.
At Beijing University, students walked out through the gate at the time lectures usually begin. Some filed quietly away in passive protest. Others set out on what in the last 3 weeks has become a well-worn 10-kilometer route to the center of the Chinese capital. These demonstrations have begun generating a bandwagon effect, not just confirming support from the committed, but also stirring new interest and fascination from workers and peasants, some of whom have now begun to become actively involved, thus widening the base of support for the protests. The limited supply of leaflets handed out are snapped up and avidly read. Some, like this worker, are willing to confirm their support for the students. Others are absorbed by what they read, but reactions to our filming show the instinctive fear many still have about being seen to be associated with the protests, despite their growing strength, and the government's acknowledgement now of the justness of some of the student grievances. As the students march with what they proudly proclaim are patriotic intentions, they've developed a growing sophistication to ensure the self-control and discipline of the demonstrations. They do not want to provoke a bloody confrontation with armed government forces known to have been flown in from the provinces. Instead, as today, they want to sharply rebuff the declared determination of aging Chinese leaders to end the protests. Last night, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, made a speech in which he said it was vital to oppose unrest like this, to maintain China's unity and stability. Mr. Zhao warned that if social unrest returned with large-scale conflict and economic disruption, China's modernization and reform would suffer. Mr. Zhao warned that a country of promise would be turned into a country of hopelessness and turmoil.
The students think the government lies.
I think Chinese Communist Party should be wise and should listen to the people at all levels.
This student compared the Chinese leadership to a donkey which must be hit to make it move.
The government is lazy, just like a donkey, like the Dazbao in Beijing. If you give it a whip, it will move a bit. If you do not beat it, it will stay still there.
If the leadership is like a donkey, it's apparently a confused donkey, uncertain in which direction to move. On the streets, it sends police to reason with leaders of the new unofficial non-government student unions. The leaders say their students will march, the police say no. Tempers flare. The students push, and by weight of numbers, they break through the police ranks. And not just once. Police were drafted in to block the demonstrators at least 3 points today on the road to Tiananmen Square, the heart of Peking, which was once again the students' goal. Police lines were breached again a mile from the square. As the marchers continued forward, 3/4 of a mile further on, alongside the red walls of the secretive compound occupied by the Communist Party leadership, another police line was drawn up. Once again, police attempts to divert the march failed. Warnings that the square was closed were ignored. Police seemed uncertain what to do and awaited orders. But the weight of several thousand students at the front of the march moved forward like a bulldozer. From our position at the front, it seemed the police did have a determination to resist, although not the resources to ensure they succeeded. Many observers here wonder whether police ineffectiveness is a sign of genuine inexperienced policing or of political indecision at the top. It could also be a subtle tactic to give the impression of a will to resist, while a new policy to accommodate student demands is being worked out behind the scenes. Today, as the tens of thousands of demonstrators swept into Tiananmen Square, there was clear evidence of the involvement now of more than just students in the protests. 300 Chinese journalists whose coverage of the current protests has been suppressed took part for the first time, joining the students in their demand for a free press and what banners said should be the right to publish the truth. Tonight, as senior officers watched the students disperse peacefully, Western observers here speculated that the heads of some national and Beijing officials will roll. The reason, their repeated failure to carry out a clear Politburo instruction to bring the protest to an end.
Tiananmen Square, the symbolic heart of China. This is where Mikhail Gorbachev should have been at 4 o'clock this afternoon. But instead of welcoming ceremonial, there was only the chaos of China's greatest political upheaval in 40 years of communism. The student army of occupation still held this ideological battleground. The government had failed to meet their demands. Earlier, from the roof of the Great Hall, Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang had spied the scene through his binoculars and ordered a change of plan. Troops edged the students into a corner of the square, though in reality it was the government that had been pushed into a corner. At Beijing airport, Mr. Gorbachev arrived to find the welcoming party had been hurriedly rearranged. The first Soviet leader to step onto Chinese soil in 30 years was greeted by President Yang Shang-kun 4 hours earlier than expected. The improvised reception was correct but cordial enough as comrades from the two great communist powers overcame their long estrangement. No bear hugs from Mr. Gorbachev, just a gentle embrace for the flower girl. There was pomp, but little of the pageantry the Chinese had planned for later in the day. The students had cheated them of that. The protesters were still pouring into the square. Teachers, journalists, striking steel workers now joining the pro-democracy movement. The hunger strikers say they'll fast throughout the summit. Troops still showed restraint, though, merely pushing back protesters to clear the way for Mr. Gorbachev's belated arrival at the Great Hall of the People. His motorcade slipped in through a side entrance. The Soviet leader was formally greeted inside by President Yang. The traditional outdoor ceremony had been abandoned, a humiliation for China's leaders on this historic day. The honored guest diplomatically avoided the subject now overshadowing the summit.
Mr. Gorbachev certainly won't be trying to capitalize on the embarrassment of his Chinese counterparts. He's well aware that such scenes of domestic unrest like these in Beijing today could just as easily be repeated in Moscow's Red Square. Both sides are growing irritated by this distraction. China and the Soviet Union both badly need this summit to succeed.
The handshake between President Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping sealed the normalization of Sino-Soviet relations, the end to a 30-year schism. Within moments, Mr. Deng was asking Mr. Gorbachev for a personal introduction to his team of senior ministers and party officials. Mr. Deng's first formal remark acknowledged the Gorbachev achievements.
Speaking frankly, the central question of world politics is American-Soviet relations. I personally saw there's a fresh content in your policy.
Deng greeted Mr. Gorbachev as comrade, crediting him for breaking the Sino-Soviet ice in his Vladivostok speech 3 years ago. Despite continuing disagreements over Cambodia, Mr. Deng shouted to the press that their talks had gone well. Mr. Deng observed to the Soviet leader there may be a turning point in the competition between the two superpowers, a change from confrontation to dialogue. The Sino-Soviet dialogue began immediately. Prime Minister Li Peng trained as an engineer in the Soviet Union in the 50s. This was the first test of the Gorbachev agenda for improved relations. Li Peng even dared to joke about the size of Mr. Gorbachev's briefing documents. This is a fat file, said the Soviet leader. Let's hope it's not empty. I hope the briefcase is full, said Prime Minister Li. It looks full, said Mr. Gorbachev. Let's hope there's actually some substance there. Meanwhile, with the Great Hall of the People as a backdrop, government negotiator Yan Minfu appeared in Tiananmen Square. He pleaded with the tens of thousands of protesting students and intellectuals to end their demonstrations and hunger strike. He said the government was prepared for reconciliation. Before leaving, Mr. Yan said the Communist Party Central Committee would not punish anyone who had taken part in the demonstrations. Government statements accusing students of being troublemakers would be withdrawn. Talks would start soon. Mr. Yan left amid both cheers and boos, offering to be a hostage if the students did not trust what he said. After all the threats to crush the students, the government appeared to have made a U-turn. As the day wore on, it had become clear that if the authorities had ever had ideas of crushing these new demonstrations, they'd missed the chance. Workers had joined this fast for democracy. With each day, the sheer size of the protest had mushroomed at what must have been an alarming rate for the government. Today, teachers, lawyers and trade union officials joined the throng. So did prominent journalists from state television and Communist Party newspapers, voicing their embarrassment at censorship of the students' cause. How long will you let the students starve? Journalists shouted to the government. A band playing the Communist Party anthem, the Internationale, signalled the 1,000 members of the Academy of Sciences and academics from high-power think tanks and research institutes. Some officials from the Central Committee sent messages of support. Workers in nearby government buildings added their support with a V for Victory banner, as students hoisted slogans on the monument where Mr. Gorbachev had been due to lay a wreath. Meanwhile, the hunger strike, the heat and the emotions were fast taking their toll of the 3,000 students who began this protest on Saturday. 250 had been taken to hospital suffering from sunstroke, dehydration and exposure. Others lay immobile on beds of ice, protected from the sun by awnings, saline drips at the ready. Some students had already given up the fast. Others said they would sacrifice their lives. Beijing hospitals dispatched medicines. Doctors said the condition of some students was a cause for concern. Even those prepared to be seen as leaders with the risk of arrest eventually succumbed. With the momentum of the protests undiminished, there'd been a carnival atmosphere, the police even taking a cue from singing demonstrators. The events in Tiananmen Square continued to upstage the historic nature of Mr. Gorbachev's visit. The Soviet leadership, however, seemed unfazed by the rival show in town.
We regard this with necessary understanding, and I could add that sometimes we have something similar. We have sit-ins and we have regular demonstrations. You know that a short while ago we lived through a very hard period.
As Mr. Gorbachev wrestled with his chopsticks, it was Deng Xiaoping who became the new center of attention. Today's images seem to confirm the view of the protesters and many disaffected Chinese that while Mr. Gorbachev cuts the image of an impressive leader in touch with reality, Mr. Deng, despite his 10 years of achievements, has lost touch with his people.
In some sense, the most eerie sense is that this is the passing of the Deng era. We see a young, vibrant Soviet leader with new ideas and a Chinese leader who's run out of ideas and is clearly, in a sense, out of control of anything except the most general kinds of principles.
How long do you believe Deng will remain at the helm then? Could he withdraw very soon after this summit?
He certainly could. The best analogy, I think, is to the Nixon visit to China in 1972, where he met Chairman Mao, who was clearly losing control. But Mao didn't die until 1976, but we had 4 years of the most distressing drift in Chinese politics and decay in terms of the economy. There was no sense of China going anywhere, and it was a very sad position. If that's what China is in for now, it's a very sad time for China, and it's very graphically evident in these recent pictures of Deng.
Something has snapped in China, unleashing a force for change that could be impossible to stop. Crowds like this have never been seen before. Tens of thousands left their work today, streaming towards Tiananmen Square in support of the hunger strikers, bringing central Beijing to a virtual standstill. Every strata of society marching in a massive show of disaffection, young and old, academics, ministry staff, factory workers, miners, even soldiers, all demanding freedom and democracy. A fleet of ambulances ferried the sickest of the students to hospital, but as each hunger striker was carried away, fresh volunteers took their places. Inside the besieged Great Hall of the People, the Soviet leader tried to concentrate on global issues when he delivered his key point speech of the summit. The only surprise, an offer to create a frontier of friendship between China and the Soviet Union, withdrawing all troops, leaving only border guards behind. Mr. Gorbachev stressed the need for regional cooperation and security, strongly renouncing the old Soviet policy of dictating to its communist allies. Later, Mr. Gorbachev and his wife went sightseeing on the Great Wall of China, as if to remind people this was, after all, a landmark visit in international relations, despite all the distractions. Amid the press of media attention, he emphasized the summit had started to break down old barriers.
Well, I have to say I particularly liked my meetings during this visit to the wall. I think that naturally one gets the image. One can say metaphorically that there should be fewer and fewer walls separating us.
Mr. Gorbachev seemed happy enough to be outdoors, though he declined to meet the students, obliquely warning that social and economic reform could not be rushed.
He sympathizes with the slogans. Of course, he doesn't think that it is the right way to make people listen to you.
But the dance for democracy did stop another summit event, the carnival crowds preventing Mr. Gorbachev reaching the Great Hall for his press conference. Troops sat helplessly in the corridors as journalists were told the conference had been moved to another venue. If the Soviet leader had arrived, this is what he would have seen from the roof of the Great Hall of the People, the seat of communist power marooned in an ocean of protest. When the news conference started 2 hours later than planned, the Soviet leader largely ducked questions on China's student issue. "I cannot be the judge," he said, though he did express hope that the dialogue between government and the students would find appropriate solutions.
China's leaders, with the notable exception of Deng Xiaoping, are showing increasing sympathy, but unless they meet the students face to face, there's little hope of them ending this protest movement, which has taken on a character all of its own. They're calling it China's spiritual liberation. Time is running out for the hunger strikers and the government. Late tonight, the scenes in the square were like a national emergency. In political terms, that's just what this has become. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Beijing.
Day 6 of this extraordinary insurrection, the centre of Beijing drenched with rain. But the anti-government and pro-student sentiments were as strong as ever. Passions were not dampened by a downpour which reduced numbers a little from yesterday's 1 million, but which brought still more workers onto the streets and gave the 3,000 hunger strikers a measure of relief from 5 days of sun. As President Gorbachev flew out of Beijing for Shanghai, the Soviet news agency TASS said the Chinese Authority had virtually lost control in the capital. Today, the protesters continue to ram home their disapproval of China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping.
It is very important to let the people in the world to know the situation in China. Deng Xiaoping is very stubborn. He should go down, immediately.
They drove home the message by also producing images of former Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. Despite Mao's fall from favour during the recent period of economic reform, the protesters see him as an honest man, not tainted by power and corruption. Meanwhile, the number of hunger strikers who'd collapsed and been taken to hospital rose to well over 2,000. The rain gave relief by reducing dehydration. So did a fleet of buses driven onto Tiananmen Square by bus drivers and the Red Cross. Letters and petitions of support poured into government offices from all sectors of Chinese society, including delegates of the National People's Congress and prestigious official bodies. As the possibility of a hunger striker dying grew by the hour, the Chinese leadership seemed to flail helpless and rudderless, struggling to maintain face, unwilling to defuse the protest by confronting the students' demands head-on. The leadership's two gestures today were rejected in humiliating fashion. At 5 this morning, Communist Party leader Zhao Ziyang and Prime Minister Li Peng visited a city hospital. Images broadcast repeatedly on state television to give the impression of a caring leadership. Prime Minister Li was seen telling students to take care of themselves. But students were seen lecturing 4 of the most senior members of the Politburo, figures normally flattered with words of adulation on the state-controlled media.
We feel corruption is the biggest problem within the Communist Party. Now what I mean is the Communist Party must re-establish its reputation among the Chinese people.
Humiliation number 2 for the Chinese leadership came later on the edge of Tiananmen Square at the Great Hall of the People. Prime Minister Li Peng met a delegation of students. After less than an hour, the talks broke down. The students still wanted the country's leaders to address them outside in Tiananmen Square.
Why they can't come here? What we want is that they should come here.
They should come here,
not come to the hospital.
No dialogue.
And most of the students who are on strike are here.
Meanwhile, the Chinese business of mending fences with the Soviet Union concluded with President Gorbachev in Shanghai. Tens of thousands of students were on the streets here too, reminding him of the political turmoil he was leaving behind in China. These were the images of Sino-Soviet coexistence, which were long scheduled as the way Mr. Gorbachev's historic visit would be remembered. But these are likely to be the enduring images, the way ahead for China far less certain than 4 days ago when Mr. Gorbachev arrived.
在这一段时间里，
Premier Li Peng appeared on state television late tonight with a grim message to the nation. Beijing was in a state of disorder, the country on the verge of chaos, and the army would be sent in to deal with it. Speaking to the Communist Party hierarchy in the Great Hall of the People, Premier Li appealed to the army to do their job. He hoped the people would support them. His words seemed to reflect the hard line of Deng Xiaoping, though the senior leader was not present. Also noticeably absent from the top table, party chief Zhao Ziyang, who'd reportedly offered his resignation after failing to stop this crackdown. President Yan Shangkun then announced the army was now surrounding Beijing, not to harm the students, he said, but to protect the city. The tension had been tightening since sunset. The voice of authority echoed over the darkened streets. Go home and you won't be punished. A chill warning to the crowd still pouring into the square. On Tiananmen itself, another drama was unfolding. Student leaders held a crisis meeting at their command center. Then came the crackly announcement. The hunger strike was over, provisionally called off to protect the students' lives. It was heralded as a great victory, not a backdown. Thousands of students were then instructed to stage a sit-down protest. They had no intention of leaving, despite the government's warnings that measures would be taken to stop the chaos.
But the decision to end the hunger strike is by no means unanimous. These aren't college students, for instance, just among several universities who have decided to carry on with their hunger strike. There are many more around the square here tonight, and that may still bring about the crackdown that's been hinted at all day by the government. You're not scared of the soldiers?
I'm not scared. I will stay here. I'm not scared. I didn't expect the soldiers even before my coming here. Doesn't matter. Somebody got to make some sacrifice.
As midnight approached, troop trucks were moving into place around the square. Dozens of them among the crowds, many towing trailers with canvas covers, their contents unknown. Unconfirmed reports said 300,000 soldiers had been drafted into Beijing. In the convoy, a bulldozer, probably to clear the squatter camp now on Tiananmen. Student reinforcements rushed to the square as the pro-democracy campaigners prepared for confrontation. Their orders, when beaten, stay calm. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
I just got back from the square. There are still a lot of students and onlookers there. It seems that they're very determined to hold on to their positions. They have listened to Premier Li Peng's speech about calling the armies into Beijing, but they're determined to stay on. The atmosphere is very tense. Students are singing songs, holding hands with each other. There's an air of a pending tragedy, I'm afraid.
How far away are the troops?
The troops now are about 5 kilometers from the square. They're being stopped at different locations by workers using their trucks to block the roads. And the onlookers are surrounding the trucks, soldiers sitting inside the trucks. They are now able to move near the square, but I don't know how long that's going to last.
Soviet television says that one of the hunger strikers has died. Can you confirm that?
I cannot confirm that. I asked the students in the square about that question. She said it's a rumor. She's not able to tell me whether that's true or not. I don't know.
How will the students react if the army moves into the square?
I think there are going to be a confrontation in a sense, not in a sense, of course, students fighting with the soldiers because they are not armed, they're young people, they're weak furthermore, but they are going to be able, they're determined to hold on to their positions. They don't want themselves to be moved away forcefully by these soldiers. So there has to be, the soldiers have to apply force to achieve their purpose of clearing the square, which is the government's objective tonight.
And will the army carry out their orders?
The army, from the soldier, I look at the soldiers, I look at their faces. Obviously, they're not very enthusiastic about doing this. They sit there idly, probably being very happy that their trucks are being stopped. But if the government insists that they should carry out their tasks, they have to. There's no choice. They're soldiers, and they are obedient to the government's orders. There's no choice.
What kind of army are they? Are they conscripts, or are they professional soldiers who will be coming in?
Oh, they're professional soldiers. There's no doubt about that. They're called in from outside Beijing. Exactly which area, I don't know. But they are professionals. They're not guardsmen. They're not civil guardsmen. Civilian guardsmen.
Premier Li Peng, in his broadcast, warned other groups not to support the students. Do you think that support will fall away from the students?
The support, well, from all I could see from the square, the support was still there. But the thing is, I don't see how that support can last under this kind of pressure. There's a lot of psychological pressure and physical pressure too, with the army approaching, encroaching upon them. But I'm sure that the intellectuals are going to support the students, maybe not this way, not stopping the soldiers, but I'm sure that they are going to come out and speak in support of the students. And I probably expect some intellectuals are going to resign from the party membership. They're going to withdraw from the party. I expect that, something like that, something of that nature to happen.
So, do you believe that within the next few hours, the square will be occupied by the troops?
Well, maybe not. I don't know. It depends on how willing they are going to use the force. It depends on how willing. I have to emphasize there that the Chinese army is not very good at using force against civilians. Not in Beijing, at least. It's not like South Korea. They can use the tear gas at free will. Chinese police and Chinese soldiers are not used to doing something like that. So there has to be some extreme pressure from the government applied to the soldiers to prod them on in order to get them to do this kind of task. But
is it possible that by putting in the army, the authorities can turn back the clock, can undo what the students have done?
No, the changes that the students have done are permanent. They have left a permanent mark on Chinese politics. What the students have done is tonight they're going to lose the battle, but eventually they are going to win the war, in the sense that it has shown to the authorities that not every order by them is going to be carried out. And the people, there's a large amount of support from the masses, from the people, for further reforms, for further democracy in China. And that realization is going to stay on in China. And that kind of change, I see, cannot be eradicated by moving troops into the square or occupying Beijing for, say, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks. That's a permanent change.
The might of China's army was stopped in its tracks tonight by the power of the people. Several divisions of troops stationed outside Beijing had been moved into the city, ready to evict the hunger strikers by force. Among the trucks, water cannons and wagons carrying barbed wire and tear gas. 3 miles from Tiananmen Square, they were halted by a human blockade. Students, helped by crowds of ordinary citizens, drove buses across the road. People urged the troops to go no further. As loudspeakers relayed the speech to the square outside, students reacted to Mr. Li's harsh message with a mixture of fear and anger. Their mistrust of the government's promises had been borne out. Student leaders immediately decided to go on with the hunger strike, which they'd earlier considered halting. Hundreds more now volunteered to join the fast. Emotions fluctuated wildly as the protesters debated what to do next.
I'm not scared. I will stay here. I'm not scared. I live in the soldiers even before my coming here. Doesn't matter. Somebody got to make some sacrifice.
As updates on troop movements reached the square, supporters rushed in to protect the hunger strikers. By sunset, tension was tightening as the government called a midnight deadline on all demonstrations. The threat of a general strike tomorrow by a new unofficial trade union had forced their hand. The voice of authority echoed over the streets, "Go home and you won't be punished." A chill warning to the people still crowding into the square. The students refused to leave, staging a massive sit-down strike, though they were now preparing for the worst. Their orders: when beaten, stay calm. Nearby, convoys of troop trucks lined the streets, waiting for instructions. But perhaps even the students had underestimated the strength of their public support, as crowds of citizens surrounded the soldiers, urging them to turn back. The people were calling the government's bluff.
As dawn approaches, there are scenes like this going on all over Beijing. Troops trapped by the people on the streets. And even if they could be moved, it's debatable whether the government would dare to put them into action. The people are telling me now that if a single drop of blood is spilt, the whole country is likely to rise up against the government. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10 in Beijing.
The troops were dressed for battle, hundreds of truckloads ringing Beijing. They wore helmets and carried Chinese assault rifles. Stern-faced young soldiers, most no older than the students and workers who now tried to block their path. In the symbolic heart of China itself, military helicopters buzzed low over the hunger strikers' camp, swooping past the Great Hall of the People. With the square still occupied by the People Power movement, it was the only way the armed forces could assess what was going on. On the northern outskirts of Beijing, a line of tanks blocked in a village street. The Chinese T-54s had been driven down from Inner Mongolia only to be halted by peaceful resistance. 14 tanks in all held hostage by the people. Buses blockaded most routes into Beijing, bringing public transport to a standstill. Students ruled the roads, policing much of this confused city. Though state radio persisted with reports that just a handful of people were disrupting traffic and production. One crowd had trapped a group of soldiers in a primary school yard. The troops said, much to their surprise, they'd been given live ammunition. They were not sure how to react as the people tried to win their loyalty. Many troops looked tired and forlorn. It was questionable whether they would have the power or the will to take the city back from their own people. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
More than 1,000 miles from the focus of the demonstrations in Beijing, yet here they marched to the same tune. Canton, the main city of the south, is called China's Hong Kong, better known for making money than the class struggle. Yet here, as in other regional capitals, thousands are on the streets demanding the resignations of Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping.
This is just one of many protests which the demonstrators say have been going on virtually every day for the last 3 weeks, and they say they won't stop until their demands are met.
The students' rallying point was the memorial to Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, still revered by both communists and nationalists today. But that's one place the authorities weren't allowing them to go, a line of armed officers guarding the gate. At the end of the march, the students returned to the university campus, where more support was in evidence in the crowded residences. Big character posters spreading the message in the traditional manner. The leader of the student protest said they had almost total support for their actions.
Yes, all the students in our college in Guangzhou, in China, support the students' action.
Does everyone here agree with what you're saying? Can you...
Most of them.
As the Chinese leadership teeters under pressure in Beijing, it's clear they can expect little comfort from the events in outlying provinces.
The Hong Kong Stock Exchange in this morning's opening hour. Hectic trading activity on the floor, a buzz of anxious voices. Analysts called it all abnormal. Sellers frantically hunted buyers, and the Hang Seng Index lost 12% of its value in just 60 minutes. Yesterday, Hong Kong witnessed what were extraordinary scenes by the standards of this politically apathetic colony. Some 600,000 people, 1/5 of the population, clogged the streets in a round the island march expressing solidarity with the striking students of Beijing. It was extraordinary because until yesterday, the biggest protest Hong Kong had ever seen on any issue saw just 6,000 people. As last night's demonstration at Hong Kong Racecourse showed, the Beijing protests have created tremors here, which have deepened already serious misgivings about Chinese terms for Hong Kong's survival after the handback to Beijing in 1997. Under the current draft of the Basic Law, when China takes control of the Legislative Council from the current British-appointed governor, 1/3 of seats will be up for election. Some Hong Kong negotiators accept that. Others say more or all of the seats must be up for election. At one of the main commuter points tonight, the new level of concern in Hong Kong could be measured by the interest and the support being offered to half a dozen communist students on hunger strike here. And as in Beijing, no one is prepared to predict what might happen.
The trigger finger had been restrained. The pressure on the soldiers from their own people had been relentless. Surrounded by peaceful and persuasive crowds, they'd begun to realize the insidious position they'd been placed in. Contrary to official orders, there was no chaos, no looting, no food shortage, just fellow comrades protecting their city during this political crisis. By first light, the street was empty. Colonel Guo and his men had pulled back. The aerial bombardment of central Beijing continued, a hail of propaganda eagerly received by the protesters, hoping to glean some hint of how the political power struggle was going. There were signs that forces opposed to martial law were gaining strength, but the students were determined not to evacuate the square until they'd received concrete evidence of conciliation. Journalists marching for free speech called for the dismissal of the man who instigated martial law, hardline Premier Li Peng. Tiananmen now resembled a foul-smelling squatter camp. After 11 days of occupation, the students were living and sleeping in a virtual garbage tip. Workers and students joined forces to keep rubbish and possible disease at bay. Rubble littered the roads around the square, the waste product of this spiritual liberation movement. The mood was relaxed as another night passed calmly. The military threat retreated and students slept more easily, saving up their dwindling reserves of stamina for a final push. Today they marched again in massive numbers in what could be the last great demonstration of this campaign. Tens of thousands called for people's law, not martial law. A show of confidence to prove that the heavy-handed action of the Communist Party's hardline leaders had backfired. There was optimism that the liberal voice of reform was winning through at the top. A dust storm whipped through Tiananmen Square. In 4 minutes, it almost did what 4 days of martial law had failed to achieve, all but sweeping away the student squatter camp. Yet this evening, the protesters were holding on, sensing a decisive victory. Rain lashed down, washing out a triumphal parade through Beijing's streets. Quite unexpectedly, we were suddenly informed that satellite transmissions out of China had been restored. No explanation given, no sign of where the order had come from, yet for the first time in 4 days, the ITN team here in Beijing is able to transmit this story to you, apparently legally, instead of smuggling it out of China as we've been doing for the last few days. Yet, as far as we know, the official news blackout is still in force. It's another bizarre twist in this endlessly confusing battle for the control of China. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Beijing. The army finally made it to Tiananmen Square, though they came in peace to raise the national flag for the first time since martial law was introduced. A clean new portrait of Chairman Mao had already replaced the picture damaged by yesterday's paint throwers. The refuse wagon swept through the square as Beijing tried to restore a sense of order. Traffic police were back on duty for the first time in a week as the city returned to normality.
In the spring sunshine, the camp of occupation looked more like a country fair. Food and drink vendors were doing good business. The hunger strike was finished, if not forgotten. 2 grandmothers had set up a free soup kitchen. They felt sorry for the students still camped out after 12 days. Everyone had pictures of this historic site, except the government. Their spy cameras had been covered up. But as the camp took on an air of permanence, it was clear the students weren't evacuating yet.
The students' movement has already achieved, or overachieved its aim. That's to arouse the people and all citizens from Beijing.
The noose was aimed at Premier Li Peng. The students say they won't leave until he is dismissed. But the moderates haven't won yet. The old revolutionaries are still hanging on. In the complex world of Chinese politics, nobody is yet sure what to believe. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
The centre of Shanghai drew to a complete halt today as once again thousands of marchers converged to join protest over the Chinese leadership. Traffic stopped dead and huge queues stretched back for miles, bus passengers abandoning their journeys and settling down to watch and join in. The demonstration beyond control, police too settled for a vantage viewpoint. The marchers seem to appear from every street, forming a seemingly endless web of protest. There's been increasing talk of a general strike here. Today the city centre may as well have been on strike. The man they say is the cause, Premier Li Peng, was held up to ridicule. And the marchers made it clear that although the protests are peaceful, they'll put up a strong fight to achieve their demands. Outside the Communist Party and government offices, the students held their daily rally. Speaker after speaker took the microphone to condemn the Chinese leadership for its attempt to impose martial law in Beijing and for ignoring the wishes of the people.
Because the government did not answer the students' request, and after the students refused to eating for 7 days, but the government did not answer us.
Despite the scale of the protest here, the students say they don't support a general strike in Shanghai. That, they say, would seriously damage the city's economy.
I think a strike is not very good for our country because Shanghai is a big city.
As the student rally continued, more marchers arrived displaying a determination that at times seems unstoppable. And as each day passes, rather than dying away, support for the action appears to be widening. Lindsay Taylor, News at 10, Shanghai.
Dusk on Tiananmen Square. It had been another day of baking sun, prolonged street protests and permanent anxiety about whether or not the divided Chinese leadership would send in the troops. For the 10,000 or so students left here, sunset meant rebuilding their shelters for another night sleeping among the smells and the rubbish of what looked like a refugee camp. Conditions are primitive and foul, but students do their best to minimize discomfort and prevent the risk of disease. Across the square, dusk heralded deliveries of free food from sympathetic residents and factory canteens. The month of protests, which eventually led to the students taking over the square, was chaotic and disorganized. But after a week here, there is routine, a strict self-imposed discipline, a determination to sit it out, continuing to defy martial law orders to clear the square. The students and fellow protesters say they are holding Tiananmen Square hostage until there is a clear commitment from the Communist Party and the government that the basic demand for greater democracy are to be met. The political infighting taking place just half a mile from here in the Communist Party headquarters compound suggests it will be a prolonged occupation. By night, students and workers have been throwing up roadblocks in the suburbs. Student control has gone far beyond Tiananmen Square itself. There's been a self-defense network designed to provide advance warning of incoming military convoys. Police are nowhere to be seen as buses are pulled across roads and the pro-democracy movement takes control of the main arteries leading to the center of the Chinese capital. Statements broadcast in the past 24 hours, underlining the army's role in restoring order, have once again cranked up the tension.
We are preparing to stop the soldiers to come here.
Are you expecting the soldiers tonight?
Maybe. Not really expected, but we think perhaps they will come here.
The roadblocks would be bypassed or swept aside by military convoys, and the exhausted students bedded down in the buses or repairing their equipment could never expect to resist a determined military advance. But the barricades underline the inertia inside a state security system apparently paralyzed by political infighting among the country's leaders. Elsewhere, a city centre normally silent and empty at night has echoed to the chants of shift workers coming to pledge their support for the students. Roving bands of motorists and motorcyclists travel to and from the suburbs to scout for any signs of military activity. In Tiananmen Square itself, some students gathered to sing satirical songs which lampooned Prime Minister Li Peng and China's paramount leader Deng Xiaoping. It breaks the monotony, fires the adrenaline, and helps regulate the emotional ups and downs of this protracted standoff with the authorities. Others played traditional Chinese board games or wrote their own diary of their part in a piece of Chinese history whose final outcome no one can yet predict.
Yeah, the students is very worried now because they didn't know what will happen. They don't know what will happen.
What do you think about the fact that Li Peng has more power now?
If now Li Peng has the more power, the students will be killed, possibly, or will be forced into the prisons.
There were signs today that student stamina is waning. A secret meeting of leaders overnight voted by only a narrow margin to continue occupation of the square. At 4 o'clock this morning, we were invited past the student guards onto the monument to revolutionary heroes, which has been base for the student leadership. Two of the leaders agreed to leave the warren of tents which made up the command post to outline to me their view of what lay ahead.
If troops intervene, the students will keep silent, even if set upon or beaten up. We won't try to defend ourselves, we won't use violence.
We wish there will be a peaceful resolution. We want it resolved by a meeting of the People's Congress. We hope that corrupt and bad leaders will be drawn by free speech, like in America.
Do you believe a peaceful solution is possible now?
I think so. I hope so.
This morning saw the first open signs of the tensions among the leaders of the student movement, who, as well as running demonstrations, had been trying to create an official structure for themselves. Other cracks appeared when the city authorities ordered the recall of the fleet of buses given to the students. As dawn broke, what the students had seen as the ominous rumors of recent days were now being realized. Nick Gowing, ITN, Tiananmen Square in Beijing.
China's countryside has been barely touched by the unrest in the cities. The peasants of Sanduhe, 50 miles outside Beijing, are as upset as anyone by inflation and corruption, but the rice crop still takes priority over politics.
As peasants, we are mainly occupied with farming. We cannot go to demonstrations. If we do, who will look after our crops?
10 years of economic reforms have created a better life in rural China, as the new government banner over Sanduhe's main street reminds the farmers. It reads,
safeguard stability and unity to protect reforms. They've heard little of the demonstrations. Most believe meddling in politics only brings trouble. A young student, Cao, is back home for the first time since taking part in the demonstrations, his presence underlining China's generation gap. His father agrees with many of his son's views, but worries about the price he might pay for expressing them.
I said you should do your best to stay away from it. You are a student. You should read books and get knowledge for your future.
Young Cao argues he has a duty to protest.
My father is not concerned about politics. His main worry is food.
Respect for old age still tempers the idealism of youth. With 80% of China's 1,100 million people still working on the land, the peasant voice is powerful, but yet to be raised in protest. Back in Beijing, the students who fight on believe they may have to make sacrifices to stir the conscience of China's silent millions.
I'm not afraid. I train my life. I want to be living happily. But if they don't allow me, then I'll give my life away for this, for happiness, for pursuit of happiness, for freedom.
Outside the gates of Communist Party headquarters, a musician taunted the leadership to open their doors and listen. The patience of China's people has a limit. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
The news from ITM.
Violence spreads in Beijing as huge crowds take on the army. Chinese troops have fired tear gas at demonstrators and the crowds have fought back with rocks and bottles. At least 30 people have been injured in a series of clashes. Army jeeps have been set on fire, demonstrators have been beaten with clubs. This is the first violence in more than 6 weeks of mass protests by the democracy campaign led by Beijing students. A short time ago, Chinese television broadcast warnings to people not to try to stop the troops advancing into Beijing. Good evening. In the words of an eyewitness on Tiananmen Square, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of dead in Beijing tonight. Democracy campaigners killed by the army as the troops stormed into the streets surrounding the square. 20 or more demonstrators were shot dead, others crushed by the military vehicles, ploughing through makeshift barricades. The students and their supporters in the square hugged each other. One said, "Tonight we are going to die." An American reporter who watched all the events unfold in Tiananmen Square tonight gives his account of how 7 weeks of peaceful demonstrations ended in bloodshed. Mike Chinoy of the Cable News Network begins his report at the point where the government speaker told the people to leave the square or to face the consequences.
The bullets are getting closer. The speakers just came on from the Great Hall of the People, warning people in the square to leave the square immediately, or the troops will take whatever action is necessary to clear the square. And we're now getting reports of gunfire immediately to the south of Tiananmen Square. We can see a big fire now, and we can also hear gunfire resuming again on the southern side of the square. Down past the Gate of Heavenly Peace, where the famous portrait of Chairman Mao hangs, a little bit past that, we can see orange flames billowing up. It looks like the protesters are building some kind of flaming barricade there in the middle of the street. You have the eerie orange glow of these fires across and down Chang'an Boulevard, and in the background now, the steady thump, thump, thump of the gunfire. And our colleagues who've just come back are saying that in the square, the talk is that people are saying people are dying all along the road here. Fire now about 50 feet across. So the symbolic heart of China, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, a scene of conflict, of violence, of bloodshed, of flames, the hopes for a peaceful resolution of this profound challenge to the authority of China's communist rulers, literally going up in smoke and fire and bullets. People are sprinting down the street. It's absolute panic. It's absolute panic. People are breaking and running. People are absolutely terrified. This is the first time that the protesters have retreated in major numbers, and for a very obvious reason, they're being fired at directly here.
And in the past hour, we've had this latest report from Beijing, where the scattered protesters in the streets around Tiananmen Square are still trying to get their wounded to hospital.
According to a colleague of mine who was in the center of Tiananmen when it began, it was a massacre. thousands of Chinese troops opening fire on protesters in and around Tiananmen Square, firing repeatedly. We do not know the exact number of casualties. They run easily into the dozens, perhaps into the hundreds. We ourselves have seen many bodies. We have seen people putting bodies onto three-wheeled carts and pedaling them away from the scene of the carnage, loading them into ambulances, their sirens blaring, the ambulances racing off to hospitals. There are still believed to be some protesters in the square, but they are basically surrounded and defeated. On the nearby streets, many people have pulled back because they've been shot at repeatedly by the soldiers. We just heard a burst of gunfire just a moment ago. I can still see crowds, but they have no chance against the kind of awesome firepower unleashed by the Chinese army.
Now for the latest on tonight's main story, the suppression of the pro-democracy protest in Beijing. Jeremy Thompson has just sent this report.
Over 24 hours after the army began its offensive, a ghostly silence shrouds Beijing, broken only by the rumble of tanks. Some 200 military vehicles now occupy Tiananmen Square. Patrols and troop convoys in huge numbers are moving through otherwise deserted streets. There are no cars, no taxis, no public transport to be seen. The road's simply too dangerous. Defiant groups of pro-democracy protesters still roam the city, risking death. Though most citizens are staying indoors, shocked and incensed that China's communist government could turn the People's Army against the people and invade its own capital city. For the moment, the gunfire has ceased, but nobody can guess how the Chinese public will react tomorrow. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
绿着打呢还。
那大相机高一点，看奶奶这儿。到这玩意儿，到这玩意儿。
老外吗？报一报，让他们真实的报一报，报道。中国的新闻机构都是不信。
My name is Bob Chen, and I'm a local resident here. And I really feel angry, really, about this, incredible violence.
声援我们中国人民吧，
真的。
声援我们，一定要声援我们。
And I can hardly find any words to speak.
不是你说你过来部队签口直接对上好了。这么点小孩都死了。这么点小孩都死了，有这么残忍不？这闹的没有。
We think that we should live peacefully. We don't want the army. We don't want gunshots and the fight. Army firing at the innocent people. We are not a handful. Only the leadership. You are a handful of people. You should step down. Or if you want to use violence, you will never know how you will die. Let's wait and see. And they had lots of army they're sending lots of army from Liaoning and other places, but they didn't give bullets to those people because they think that if those people think they are too violent, they might fight. They might fight.
What do people think of the government?
Well, they think the government is barbarous. It's inhuman. No longer like what they imagined. They think they would be. Incredible, really incredible.
这个我们还向全世界公布支援我们人民吧，声援我们应该。
本来是党指挥，谢谢，真的不是铁板一块。
是希望他们也得注意点安全。
我们求得国际上对我们的声援，我们声援，对我们老百姓声援，不能再这样下去了，再这样下，老百姓声援，老百姓死的人更多，流血之冤更多。
The media is simply not telling the truth, and no one can understand what they're talking about. They said that the army man was killed on the Zhengguomen overpass by the people, but it's not true. I saw with my own eyes it was crashed by its own armed vehicle, and the two foreign tourists saw that.
我们手无寸铁，忍无可忍。
不是我们在搞，人民在搞动乱，是他们中央一小撮在搞动乱。我们人民是好的，人民争取自由。
The Chinese people are standing up.
Yeah.
哎，前面有飞弹，到了。
大家准备有了，带上去，不用。少了点。大家准。
Hello, good evening. Chinese and diplomatic sources report fighting on the outskirts of Beijing between units of the People's Army. The Western world finally begins to harden its response to the Army's continuing killing of unarmed protesters in Beijing. President Bush suspends government-to-government sales, weapons deliveries and military visits. President Mitterrand declares a regime which is reduced to opening fire on youths it has educated and who have risen up in the name of freedom has no future. The Foreign Secretary tells the Chinese charge of Britain's outrage at the killings. In Beijing, some troops continue firing whilst others are seen deserting their tanks. 1,000 protesters are known to have been killed, but the full death toll may never be known. The British ambassador in Beijing calls British students into the embassy compound for protection. And a run on China's bank in Hong Kong as the colony's stock market falls 22%. But first, in Beijing, Chinese troops once again fire on civilians, killing an unknown number in the attempt to crush the pro-democracy movement. But tonight, there are a growing number of reports, as yet unconfirmed, of fighting between hardline units of the People's Liberation Army and those opposed to the clampdown. Foreign embassies have warned their citizens to keep off the streets. British students are taking refuge in the embassy compound. There's been worldwide condemnation of the Chinese military action. President Bush has suspended military sales to Beijing and banned official visits. The UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar issued a rare rebuke to the Chinese leadership. We have a series of reports from China itself and from the United States. First, this report on the Army's crackdown from ITN's Far East correspondent Jeremy Thompson in Beijing.
The Army now holds the key to China's murderous power struggle. All day, the crackle of gunfire has haunted this capital city. Convoys of troop carriers charge through the streets, soldiers shooting at random, sometimes at people, often just into the air. As trucks cruise past, a Western man crouched for shelter behind a parked car, covering his two frightened children. There are fears that some elements of the military are running out of control, growing signs of splits within the army. Tiananmen Square is held by frontline veterans of the 27th Army, loyal to President Yang Shangkun, suggesting a power bid by the president himself. It was these troops who carried out Sunday's massacre. Today, eyewitnesses saw them mow down waves of cycling students. In 2 days, these soldiers have turned the avenue of everlasting peace into China's street of eternal shame. In contrast with evidence of other military units in disarray, curious crowds gathered round a column of 73 burned-out armored cars and trucks. Troops had abandoned their vehicles, apparently setting some ablaze themselves. They told citizens they didn't want to go into battle. Souvenir hunters climbed over the charred carriers, picking up spent shells. Some troops were told they would be shot if they didn't follow orders. As the full horror of the bloodletting began to sink in, residents wandered the streets, numbed and outraged.
I can hardly find any words to speak.
What do the people think?
People, we think that we should live peacefully. We don't want the army. We don't want gunshots and the fight. Army firing at the innocent people.
Across China, there were reports of strikes and widespread disruption of public transport. At university campuses, students waited for the inevitable crackdown. The colleges have been the hotbed of this pro-democracy movement. But the slaughter goes on unabated. We visited hospital morgues piled high with bodies. They're running out of space to store the unending procession of victims. Beijing is a city in grief today, as black armbands were issued out of respect for the dead.
groups of ordinary citizens discussed ways of hitting back. There was now nothing else worth living for, they said, except the fight for freedom and democracy.
Despite all these efforts to thwart them, the army looks set to stay indefinitely. Their presence the only way that this current Communist Party leadership can stay in control. The government of the people has become totally discredited in the eyes of the people. The massacre ordered by those in power has pushed China to the verge of anarchy. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Beijing.
President Bush announced the freeze on arms deals with China at a specially called news conference today. He said he could not ignore the implications of the violent and bloody attack on the students for Chinese-American relations. The United States recently sold more than £400 million worth of arms and electronics to the People's Liberation Army. In Hong Kong, the governor, Sir David Wilson, expressed outrage at the Chinese military action and tried to reassure the colony about the handover to Chinese rule in 1997. But the financial markets took fright, plunging more than 500 points overnight after the massacre. Here, the government is under increasing pressure to re-examine the terms of Chinese rule. Today, the Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, called in the Chinese chargé. Sir Geoffrey now joins us from our studio in Westminster. Sir Geoffrey, did you warn the chargé of the kind of measures that Mr. Bush has taken on America's behalf?
I told him, first of all, how absolutely outraged and horrified we are by what has happened, how it is impossible to continue with the arrangements that currently exist, for example, for visits one way or the other. We had the Chinese Minister of Justice due to come here later this week, which would have been a contradiction in terms. So visits of that kind have had to be cancelled. Work on the joint declaration, the basic law in Hong Kong, has had to be suspended. We made it very clear that what we want to see is a repudiation of this ghastly series of events in Peking. We want to see a restoration of decent standards of government there. Now, this may sound as though one's beating the air, but the important thing is that events are moving very quickly, very unpredictably in China. What has happened in the last few days, the crackdown by these brutal, ruthless military authorities, may not be the last word. We've heard of conflicts there even in recent hours. And what one must hope for is that those huge forces of sanity and common sense that had been bringing China into contact with the rest of the world may yet have a chance of recovering control. This is the central message at the moment. Meantime, of course, during these awful events, we cannot continue with business as usual, far from it.
Well, surely our problem, Sir Geoffrey, is that in 1997 we have to hand over Hong Kong. There's no alternative to that. Doesn't this whole crisis throw into the sharpest possible relief the reservations so many have always had about that procedure?
Of course it does. But the procedure springs, you see, from what I've described so often as the inescapable facts of geography and history. Hong Kong is a tiny, immensely valuable colonial territory on the corner of the huge mass of China, 5 million people with 1.25 billion people in the mainland alongside it. And we have a lease to that runs out in 1997. Now, it is not possible to build a totally different future against that geographical and historical background.
But
so we have worked hard and successfully, as everyone acknowledges, with the Chinese government that had been moving closer to the standards of the rest of humanity. Now, the awful thing is what has now happened in the events of the last few days. And it's for that reason that we must all of us hope, and indeed this is the voice of people from Hong Kong expressing the same hope, that the forces of sanity and reason can recover the ground and restore better standards of government in Peking. Even that, of course, doesn't overcome the shock to confidence of what's happened in the last few days. I'm aware of that as much as anyone.
But, Sir Geoffrey, what precisely are our obligations to be after 1997 if that word may, you say may, things may yet change back for the better again, but if that may doesn't come to pass, what are our obligations going to be?
Well, it's far too soon to begin answering questions of that kind about something that is still 8 or 9 years away. I'm deeply aware, God knows nobody's more aware than I am, of the implications and the difficulties of this. But a great deal can happen between now and that time. We've got at the moment a joint declaration which everyone regarded as the best possible achievement one could have got. But of course the effectiveness of that depends upon the continued commitment, not only of our government, but of a Chinese government to the fulfillment of that.
Is there
and
any
at the moment, that is clearly something one can't assert with confidence.
Is there any question of responding to those calls from people who believe that the rescinding of the passport rights, that right of refuge in this country, should be reconsidered?
Well, I think one's got to look at that, quite frankly, against the realistic history of this country. We have built up, understandably, over the years since the war, a profound conviction that we cannot provide a home for the literally hundreds of millions of people who could have claimed the right to come here from the days of empire. And as part of that change of position, the people of Hong Kong do not have the right to come here, those who are entitled to claim British citizenship. Now, if you reflect at the enormous difficulties posed when some tens of thousands of Ugandan nations claimed that right in the early 1970s, and then consider that we're talking now about 3.25 million Chinese residents of Hong Kong, you've got to see the enormous implications of arguing that case. I know some people have said then they should be given the right to come here as an insurance policy because they'll never need to use it. But how honest or realistic is that? I, again, totally understand the deep sense of anxiety in Hong Kong. Nobody understands it better than I. For the whole of the last 10 or 11 years, I've been working to try and carve out a better, more secure future for them. And I fully realise just how enormously awful these events are. But one can't begin jumping to quick conclusions and quick responses that would be extremely difficult to fulfil. I think it would be very difficult to present to the Parliament and the British people.
Sir Geoffrey, thank you very much for joining us. As we've been on the air, there have been fresh reports of gunfire and explosions in Beijing. With me now is Dr. Jerry Siegel of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. But first, we're joined on the line from the Chinese capital by our Foreign Affairs correspondent, David Smith. David, can you tell us from what you can deduce what you know of the latest on the military clashes?
John, within the past hour, we've heard of fairly furious activity on the outskirts of the city and around Tiananmen Square in the heart of the capital. It seems that the army units now in control of Beijing, and they're the ones loyal to the hardliners in this government, it seems that those units are preparing to defend their positions. Now, they're not going to be defending them against unarmed civilians, of that we can be sure. They'll be defending them against other army units. By all accounts, there has been sporadic gunfire, but no more than that. What we can conclude is that this is now a conflict within the army, as much as between the army and the students. And if that's the case, then this country may be in for days, if not weeks, of a bitter and murderous power struggle.
So at the moment, David, it sounds very much as if we have soldiers versus soldiers and what the demonstrators mainly off the streets.
Yes, John, we drove through the city about 3 hours ago, and it was relatively quiet, I have to say that. But Beijing does look like a city at war. There are troops everywhere. What struck me more than anything else was small groups of people standing on street corners, talking to the soldiers once again as they were a few days ago. The indelible impression I had is of a people who know what to expect now, and that's a conflict within the army.
David, stay on the line. Jerry Siegel, conflict within the army, will it actually come to all-out bloody confrontation, troops against troops, beyond the sort of sporadic engagements we're hearing of, or will they back off at some point?
It's still not clear. There must, I think, be some kind of fighting between the two large military units. The difficulty is the hardliners look like they've come in from outside, they have no base. And in a sense, the Beijing troops can just stare them out and then starve them out. And then we will have a standoff. But in a sense, the people of Beijing have made it possible for there to be some glimmer of hope now. And the Beijing troops, I think, will hope that they can get away without a fight. My guess is, however, we will have more fighting, but now fighting between army units.
But fighting that must result in the end to returning to the smoke-filled rooms and letting the leadership sort it out themselves. I mean, we're not looking at the antecedents of a coup.
Well, if what we've already seen is a coup, then what we're looking at is a counter-coup or an attempted counter-coup. It is possible that we will have a standoff that will send people back to the smoke-filled rooms. It is possible we'll have so much smoke and fighting on the streets that the battles will actually take place on the streets, and it depends which troops win will determine which political forces win. It seems to me more likely we'll get a bit of fighting and then the politicians having to go back and to sort it out among themselves.
David Smith in Beijing, presumably it's impossible to deduce what's going on behind closed doors. Any sense at all, movements of large cars, any sense that the leadership is yet again in session?
I don't think, John, that anyone is in a position to judge just precisely what's happening here at the top. You know, Deng Xiaoping, the senior leader of this country, is said to be seriously ill. We learned that in the past few days. But that has been said any number of times in the past. What's clear and what we do know is that Deng authorized the killings and the bloodshed over the weekend, and that he's given free rein to the old guard. For Deng, I don't think there can really be any way back now. But at the same time, those who oppose what he's done, within the army, within the party, within the ruling elite, for them as well, this is perhaps now a battle for survival. And that's why the situation is so dangerous and potentially so explosive.
David Smith in Beijing. We must leave it there. Jerry Siegel in London, thank you. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
基本他们没人住我。我去趟湖南卫视。
霍梅尼校长的葬礼将在北京和所有本土上参加竞选的政府控制下的下一位举行。在上医院周期内参与了团结工会立的。日本第一任首相被竞开场说，日本需要进行基本的政治改革，来恢复它的内部的民主。他对围绕伊斯兰克。在去年的世界电气联盟宣谈，北京局势仍然十分的紧张，有消息说军队出现了分裂。北京天安门广场一带全是坦克，据报道，已经有数以千计的人民群众被人民解放军开枪打死，用坦克压死。本台记者报道，北京几个小时前的提示，自从大前天凌早发生连续的屠杀事件以后，北京仍然处于战争的状态。究竟有多少人死伤？现在正在街道上的障碍物起火焚烧，也听得见机关枪开枪的声音。远方的美国留学的中国学生会获得政治庇护。相信美国政府不可能像普通老百姓那样。
在1997年归还给中国，但是英国的小党社会民主党领袖阿什的。
那个群众说，昨天建队以后，中国的国民党。
asettaminen paikkakunnassa. 他会放下，不能这么喊。
跟他没有道理可讲，讲不了道理。
现在接着，
没有道理，没有真理。
这时候他们根本不是讲道理，
没有真理。
就是他们已经都干过来了，还他们不是？他们就不讲理，
没有真理。
再跟他讲理，那就是只能死对。
现在有什么可讲？这就是血腥镇压。
是，没什么理可讲的。你说你没让讲理，上两个教理，让你敲教理。他妈的，
有
擦脚吗？另外一点。啊，他是不说洗屏了，
风头不错。
他们溜还有胶卷吗？可以说话。还有这种胶卷，卖我这。
外边电台电台
听不懂，看到我也说话，我好说完了，我也要。
人家不会有院，人家不加评论，人家给你报道这事儿不加评论。
谁在报道什么事儿，他也没看到。有没有？还有没有？
还有新闻你哪知道？人家甭管他的都算。
这不抢不住啊！把那弄过来应该。把那个。把这个胶卷，胶卷有没有？没照过胶卷卖一个。那瓶盖给上瓶盖。
他妈趁现在的机会，他妈让你记了。
来不？
这是。真的。让人民不让我们看。想买。现在。老外都给放了。
干嘛呀？他妈的，就是他妈的不分情况的。哦，那身上有水，是吧？有过。那边是今年不对那个。真是。哎，现在这可不错了，全是楼，他们枪呢？枪吗？没有，一支了。这是什么？95个。然后4个啥呢？枪有枪。是巨人吗？是啊。破衣裳了，本地上。过的路的呀。
别打，别打。